Thank you very much. Anyhow, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time ever in Skibbereen, but in a sense, I feel I've been here before because for the last few years, I've been working on not on today's topics at all, but on the Great Irish Famine. And of course, Skibbereen bulks very large in any exploration of the Irish famine. So in that sense, I feel I've been here. Actually, things have changed incredibly from the mid-19th century. You know, traffic lights, one-way system, roundabouts, and so on. So modernity clearly has dawned as compared to the mid-19th century. Now, just to show I haven't been totally idle or even forgetting Skibbereen over the last year or two, I thought I'd show a slide relating to the Great Famine, relating to Skibbereen. What it indicates is the catastrophic decline in births and the birth rate in Skibbereen during that great crisis of the Great Famine. So that's the, hopefully, of local interest. And now for something completely different, as Monty Python might say. I want to talk, first of all, about the IRA and the Protestant experience of intimidation in the early 20th century, really following on in much less detail from what Brian Walker was saying just before the break. And then I want to jump forward in time to the end of the 20th century, what we euphemistically label the Troubles, roughly 1969, 50 years ago, to 1998. Now, there are huge differences between those two periods, and I would emphasize, we were talking about this just beforehand, I would emphasize I'm not engaging in some kind of comparative study. The difference between the two periods is enormous. And I would also emphasize that there are, of course, other experiences, those of the IRA, their families, supporters, the wider Republican movement, the experiences of the Crown forces, and, of course, of the civilian, Catholic, and nationalist communities in the two periods. Now, as historians, I suppose we tend to approach these kinds of issues frequently through the prism of region, gender, social class. And I may have a tiny bit to say about those facets later on, but that's mainly work for another day. Let me put in a note of appreciation. For the first period, the 1920s, I'm drawing on the invaluable work of Cal Hyland, who I think is known to a number of people here. Cal gathered together the 3,400, 500 or so applications for compensation to the Irish Grants Committee in the 1920s. These are submissions made by those who suffered or alleged they had suffered at the hands of the IRA. And Cal kindly gave me a copy of his data set, and so in more recent times I've been filling in the religious affiliation of the various applicants, which doesn't appear in the official documentation. And so far we've identified about 60% in terms of religious affiliation of the applicants. We hope to push that up to 80% eventually, but as they say, Bíonn Gachtas Nulog, every beginning is weak. So it's work in progress. Oh yeah, the IGC, the Irish Grants Committee rather. Actually, this slide doesn't tell you very much, does it? But let me fill it in. The Irish Grants Committee received claims from those who suffered in Ireland from the period of the truce onwards, July 1920 onwards, suffered as a result of their loyalty to the British state and the Crown. So it's a body set up by the British government to compensate people for who were victims or claimed to be victims of violence, intimidation, house burning, a whole range of actions which impacted adversely on their livelihoods, their health, their welfare, and so on. Now, by and large, the claims for compensation relate to the 26 counties. In fact, I've stripped out the small numbers that relate to the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And what I would suggest is that this is a window across most of Ireland, a window on the threats of violence directed at those deemed loyal to the British state and hence enemies of the IRA. So let me summarise what's contained in the data set. This is from the 26 counties, what became the Irish Free State, later Irish Republic, Republic of Ireland, I suppose I should say. You have roughly 3,400 claimants. And most of the claimants are male. There's a significant minority of women claimants as well, and within those a scattering of widows, I suppose, for rather obvious reasons. Now, in terms of those whose religious affiliation we've identified, the Church of Ireland, 1,182 claimants, Roman Catholic, 765. Methodist, I was slightly surprised, rather more than Presbyterian, because fair numbers of Methodists in the Cork region, Presbyterian 79. The total, it doesn't add up simply because we have many unidentified claimants at this stage. So what it suggests is that you have roughly twice as many Protestant claimants as Roman Catholic to the IGC. But it makes more sense to look at that relative to share of population. And what this suggests is that there's an overrepresentation, a six-fold overrepresentation of Protestant claimants as compared to Catholic complainants. So that might suggest a very extensive and a wholly disproportionate degree of, if you like, oppression visited on Protestants within the 26 counties. However, I think there are some questions we should pose. Were Protestants more likely to apply to the Irish Grants Committee? Secondly, were Protestants more likely to resist the IRA and hence draw down retribution? And thirdly, were the motives for intimidating Protestants different? One's tending, in terms of that question, in the direction of how important was sectarianism as a motive, which came up in the previous session. I think the answer to the first question is it's quite likely that Protestants were more likely to apply, although I would also add, when the possibility of grants or compensation is on offer, ask Irish farmers, people are not usually backward in coming forward. In relation to the second, most Protestants were not nationalists. They did not support the Republican cause. And then the question becomes, were many of them prepared to risk life and limb in defying the IRA? And I think that is questionable. What I'm distinguishing here is between behaviour and privately held opinions. As my colleague and friend Paul Bewis put it, in the Ireland of the early 1920s, it was possible to state publicly any political position, provided, of course, it accorded with the Republican position. You know, a bit like Henry Ford and getting whatever colour car you liked, provided it was black. The third question I find more difficult to answer, at least in terms of this particular body of documentation. The numbers are large, as you've seen earlier. The numbers of claimants are large, and many were successful. And that does point towards the widespread intimidation of Protestants with varying degrees of intensity across Ireland. But I would suggest the material ideally needs to be combined with evidence from other types of compensation claims made to the Irish government, Irish Free State government, for the same period. That's July 1921 through to 1923, you know, the post-truce and Civil War period. So in a way, to make sense of, you know, that sixfold disproportion, I think we need to integrate this material into a larger framework of evidence, particularly other types of compensation claimants. Now, I'll return to that in a moment, but I thought it might be useful to look at some actual claims and claimants, not 3,500 or whatever, claims from my own county of Tipperary, All-Ireland hurling champions in waiting 2019. And because of the pressure of time, I'll only mention 3 case studies. The first slide, which isn't here, I call the wedding day. It's from the parish of Drum in mid-Tipperary. John Gleeson, a farmer and former sergeant in the RIC. He was long retired, actually. He was retired in 1911. He was attending his sister's wedding in Drum Parish Church in February 1922. His daughter was marrying a former RIC man, so you can see how certain social networks worked. As the couple came out of the chapel in Drum, she was handed a note. You might think it might have been a wedding present. In fact, it was. She was ordered to leave the country within 24 hours. Her husband, her brother and sister were also ordered to leave. Now, the Gleesons, in fact, didn't leave. They were small farmers in the parish of Drum. But they were boycotted, they had hay burned, meadows spiked, cattle driven off. But on a more positive note, they did actually survive all of this and come through it. The second case study I refer to as the 10 acres. So the first, the wedding day, the second, the 10 acres. The second is close by, close to the parish of Drum in Borrisolee, my home parish, and it relates to the Wallace family. Yes, I could talk quite a bit about them. They were friends with my grandfather, very involved in the local cooperative and so on. Anyhow, the local IRA attacked the Wallace family home and farmstead quite a number of times, and eventually the Wallaces were ordered to give up 10 acres to a local IRA family or pay a £500 fine, which they weren't able to do. The Wallaces were medium-sized farmers. These are not large farmers at all. They'd sheep stolen, the hay barn was burnt down, and there was regular firing of bullets at the house. In fact, when I spoke to a member of the family some years ago, he pointed out the bullet marks round the windows at the front of the house. They were also fired at, he told me, or father was fired at when attending church in the nearby Kilfith Church of Ireland church. And the third example I want to give, again from Tipperary, and this is a particularly unpleasant one, so I don't want to go on at any length. On the 5th of August 1922, groups of armed men, at least one in uniform, probably more, gained entry to the house of Mr. Biggs at Drumineer on the Shannon, County Tipperary. It was 1 a.m. in the morning. The armed intruders restrained Mr. Biggs and a visitor he had to the house, Mr. Thomas Webb, and then proceeded to seriously sexually assault Mrs. Harriet Biggs. Now, unusually at the time, the local newspaper, the Nina Guardian, published quite a bit about this. Not only that, it did actually use the word rape, which is relatively unusual in my experience in newspaper coverage of the period. And actually here perhaps I could refer very quickly to the work of Professor Linda Connolly. I was at the other West Festival a week ago, the West Belfast Festival, Féile an Phobal in another language, which my friend Ruth Dudley Edwards once called a Provo Fest. It has changed over the years. It was a long time ago, Ruth. It hasn't changed all that much, though. Anyhow, Linda is researching, as are others like my colleague Marie Coleman, researching sexual violence during the War of Independence, Civil War period. And their views are that the extent of sexual violence has been downplayed for all kinds of, reasons of reticence, concern for survivors, and so on. I mean, understandable reasons at one level. On the other hand, we do have to face up to some of the brutal episodes of the past. And I do take John Horn's point yesterday that, and others, that the extent of violence in Ireland during this period is not comparable to what happened in Upper Silesia or parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. Nonetheless, and I think Linda would emphasize this point strongly, it's time that we did begin to explore more fully the extent of sexual violence during those early troubles, if you like, and acknowledge them. Now, going back to the Biggs family, the men in court, there were 2 Hogans and 2 Graces. One of the Hogans was a captain in the anti-treaty IRA. Oh, incidentally, I should say, in relation to sexual violence during this period, we're talking about sexual violence perpetrated by Crown forces, by the anti-treaty IRA, and indeed by the Irish Free State Army. Again, that's a whole topic for another day. So the Biggs house was looted, but also Mrs. Biggs was gang raped by the intruders. Mr. Webb, the visitor, gave evidence later on that she was almost unconscious at the end of her ideal. And I'm afraid there's no happy ending, no silver lining. She died in a mental asylum years later. So to kind of sum up this kind of first half of the paper, as it were, beginning of the early decades of the 20th century, my conclusion from what really is a preliminary look at the Irish Grants Committee compensation claims as a whole is very much in line with, say, Brian Hughes' recent book, It's a very fine book called Defying the IRA, Intimidation, Coercion and Communities During the Irish Revolution. And Hughes concludes from his intensive study of County Cavan, and indeed other studies, county studies of the revolutionary period, it concludes, and this really would be my conclusion as well, that the IRA labelling and targeting of civilian suspects did take account of the religion, the social class, and the status of its victims. However, I'd like to go further, and I absolutely acknowledge the terror inflicted on the civilian population by the Crown forces. But as the IGC files make clear, some IRA volunteers and some soldiers of the Irish Free State were as black as the blackest black and tans in their vindictiveness and their self-righteous violence, and usually against quite defenceless victims. So the heroic narrative of the independence struggle, the green jingoism we grew up with as school kids, may still satisfy the hero worshippers and fantasists, but it bears little relationship to the historical experience of inhumanity displayed between 1919 and 1921, but particularly, especially during the Civil War. And actually, if I was to mention one book, you get tired of academics and professors and so on there to a penny, but there's a wonderful book by Fergal Keane on family reminiscences from North Kerry, the Listowel area, which brings out the horror, the intimacy, the fear engendered in a small community in North Kerry. It's called simply Wound, W-O-U-N-D. Now, I want to shift quickly northwards to the later 20th century, or what is euphemistically called the Troubles. I've more or less completed a book on the Troubles, and I can hear some of you saying, yet another book on the Troubles, and almost groan-making. Actually, I share that feeling. But anyhow, for some reason, perhaps because I live in Belfast, I felt impelled to write it. On Thursday, driving south from Belfast, I realised belatedly that it would be hard to summarise a book in 15 minutes or so. And that was before my car broke down on a roundabout outside Waterford. I took this as not revenge for Skibbereen, but revenge for Waterford at the hands of Tipperary in various Munster hurling finals. Anyhow, I did get here. And what I will present are really some headline points, largely devoid of context. Actually, you're going to have fewer headlines than I'd intended. I had hoped to photocopy this rather large table, but the hotel said 100 or so copies was too expensive, and so we do not have it. So I'm going to have to just imagine there is a slide which shows some of these data statistics, because it's quite hard to take in, unfortunately, just verbally. And what I have to say is taken from David McKittrick's wonderful, one of the saddest books written in Ireland in this generation, and that is Lost Lives, some of you may be familiar with. So I've recalculated some of the figures therein. I suppose the headline one, which David presents, is the number of Troubles-related deaths. This is up to 1966 to 1999. So over 3,500 Troubles-related deaths. And Republican paramilitaries were responsible for 6 out of every 10, 60% of those deaths. The Provisional IRA was responsible for half of all deaths. Oh, sorry, yeah. Okay. Fortunately, it's not coming in here yet. Do I need to run over those again very quickly? The number of troubles-related deaths in excess of 3,500. Actually, nowadays it's close to 4,000. Republicans were responsible for 6 out of every 10 deaths. The Provisional IRA was responsible for half of all deaths. Loyalists were responsible for 3 out of every 10 deaths. And this is something that surprises people usually, I think. The RUC and the British Army plus UDR, were responsible for 1 out of every 10 deaths. So the RUC responsible for about 5% of deaths. The Army, British Army, for another 5%. And what's very clear from the work David McKittrick and indeed others have done is that it is civilian casualties that dominate the whole story of the Troubles. The numbers of Troubles-related civilian deaths is in excess of 2,000. That's 2,000 out of 3,600 or so. Catholic civilian, within that, Catholic civilian deaths bulk larger than Protestant ones, about 2 to 1. For me, one of the more surprising findings when I began to rejig the figures was the number of deaths suffered by the Republican movement, which was 392, just under 400, quite small fraction of the total. And loyalist paramilitaries, in that sense, did even better. Something like 144 met violent deaths. Security force deaths are much higher, over 1,000. And perhaps, one could go on, and we begin to glaze over with, or I do anyhow, an array of statistics. But maybe I should mention, in relation to the Provisional IRA, most Provisional IRA volunteers were not killed by the security forces. Something like 60% were killed, executed as informers, died while handling guns, while handling explosives, while driving cars on active service, and so on. So it's quite striking. The greatest danger to you as a Provisional IRA volunteer was not the RUC or the British Army, it was actually your own organisation, either directly or indirectly. So it's a pity I haven't been able to provide the table for you, because I think it's quite a good thumbnail sketch of the Troubles. And what we've seen is that in terms of that breakdown of killings, the Provisional IRA was the main killing agency during the Troubles. But I think, in a way, that almost underestimates the significance of the provisional offensive or insurrection. They were the spearhead, or the cutting edge, as Martin McGuinness once put it. Martin McGuinness said, voting in elections is all very well, but it won't get us a united Ireland. The IRA is the cutting edge of the fight for Irish freedom. So the Provisional IRA is I would put it as the spearhead in the campaign to coerce 900,000 Protestants and Unionists into another state, into the Republic of Ireland. Protestants were the principal targets through their membership of the RUC and the UDR, as were Protestant-owned businesses during that phase of the IRA's economic war, targeting economic enterprises, businesses, in a few instances, some very tragic ones, executing business executives to cripple the Northern Ireland economy. Now, the point is often made that the RUC was largely Protestant, which of course is true. 91% of the members of the RUC in the 1980s were Protestant. But the other way of looking at this is to say that it was that Protestant section of the population which bore the brunt of containing the Troubles and averting what was potentially an out-and-out civil war, which would have taken us in the direction of the Balkans, in my view. Fortunately, that did not happen, but this was definitely playing with fire. So the burden on the RUC, who, as I say, almost exclusively Protestant, it was a burden written in blood with the killing of some 500 policemen and policewomen. Now, there's another aspect of the Provisionals campaign which I don't think has been sufficiently emphasised. The Provisional IRA was almost wholly responsible for driving the conflict onwards, year after bloody year. So I'm not focusing on end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, when political conditions, military conditions in Ireland are chaotic, but just thinking of the decade of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. It was the Provisional IRA who drove that conflict decade after decade, before finally implicitly admitting defeat for its main objective in with the statement of a total cessation of violence in 1994. So my point is, had the Provisional IRA reached their, if you like, 1994 point of realization earlier, say in 1973 with the signing of the Sunningdale Agreement, or indeed in 1972 when the official IRA declared a ceasefire. Now, I know that was somewhat ragged, they didn't entirely depart the field, but by and large they did. But had the Provisional IRA taken either of those two opportunities in the early 70s to leave the field, then, literally thousands of people and tens of thousands of people have been injured and maimed in both communities would be, well, many of those would be alive, and many of those who are alive would be much better off. So what I'm suggesting is that the Provisional IRA supplied the dynamic, the motive force for 3 decades of political violence, and in that sense was primarily responsible for the Troubles. And I won't dwell on this. Hopefully you can read that. But just in case there's any confusion about what the Provisional IRA were about, these are statements from principal actors. Actually, I will comment on the first one, which is historically important. It's the first issue of An Phoblacht in February 1970, in a sense an almost foundational statement. We will erect the Irish Republic again in all its glory, no matter what it costs, and so on. So the Provisional IRA was not about civil rights. It was not primarily about defence of Catholic communities. It was about achieving a united Ireland by force of arms. Now, I'm not sure if you can see this. I want to say a little bit about voting figures and support for Sinn Fein, the political wing of the Provisional IRA. And it's, again, this rather surprised me that in the early 1980s. Of course, I lived through this, so I should have remembered, but Sinn Fein, following the hunger strikes, achieved really a remarkable electoral gains, securing almost 1/3 of the nationalist vote. Obviously not any unionist votes, but so this is all in terms of the nationalist vote. So as early as the beginning of the 1980s, Sinn Fein, the political wing of the IRA, was receiving very substantial electoral support from northern nationalists. And nowadays, jumping to the bottom of that slide, nowadays Sinn Fein achieves, it varies from election to election, and of course we'll be having one soon, I would guess, but something like 70%, so overwhelming support now within the northern nationalist community. And there's quite a contrast there with political parties linked to loyalist paramilitaries. Their high point was in 1998, the assembly elections just after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. The Progressive Unionist Party and the Ulster Democratic Party, one linked to the UVF, one linked to the UDA, they achieved 7% of the popular vote. But it's been all downhill since. It's about 1% currently, and the UDA-linked grouping has disintegrated. Progressive Unionist Party still exists, but it gets about 1% of the Unionist vote. And that's a huge contrast between, whether one likes it or not, between the two political communities in Northern Ireland. 70% of nationalists vote for a party with its roots deep in the Provisional IRA. Now, that brings me towards the end. How are we doing? Right. Okay. Yes, sure, absolutely. Yes, I'll condense this greatly, but it brings me to a conclusion that's, for someone from a nationalist background, is uncomfortable, and which is why I've sat on it for a long time. And it is that looking at support for Sinn Fein through the 1980s, 1990s, and on into the present, what we see is a spectrum of tolerance within Northern nationalism. At one end of the pole was the minority of hardcore insurrectionists, the Provisional IRA, determined to drive the British out of Ireland by military force. In the broad middle of the spectrum were those who were critical of particular IRA actions, but by and large were prepared to cohabit with them, live with them. And then you have the bystanders who are either indifferent or taciturn about political violence and so on. And this pushes me in the direction of suggesting, and this is in the nature of a hypothesis at this stage, that what we are seeing in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s is an oppressive minority largely shaping what went on within the context of Northern Ireland. Now, you may find that surprising or unpalatable or whatever, and we usually think in terms of unionist oppression. But let me quote Charles Brett, a leading member of the Northern Ireland Labour Party, who said, summed up by saying, the Catholic grievances did not amount to oppression, but the Catholic minority received less than fair treatment from the Protestant majority. David Trimble spoke of a cold house for Northern nationalists. But what happened between 1970 and 1998 or a bit beyond is really of a qualitatively different nature. And I think there is a basis for suggesting that in some instances, some historical contexts, and we can think of parallels elsewhere in the world, there is such a thing as an oppressive minority. And in that sense, the Republican community, and perhaps extending further into the nationalist electorate, can be categorized as an oppressive community. Thank you.